For 22 years, starting officially in 1948, the United States Air Force was responsible for investigating reports of unidentified flying objects. That investigation began with a serious, high-priority status to search for answers. About a year later, those involved created an estimate of the situation. That was an intelligence analysis of the events that had taken place. The conclusion was that the flying saucers were interplanetary craft. The Air Force Chief of Staff, General Hoyt S. Vandenberg, rejected the analysis, and nearly everyone involved in its creation found themselves reassigned. The UFO project, then known as 𝐶𝑖𝑒𝑛𝑐𝑒, fell into disarray. After a series of officers had been put in charge and a name changed, first to Grudge, then Blue Book, investigations became a priority. They didn't last very long, and eventually Blue Book became little more than a public relations operation designed to convince the public that the Air Force was doing its job, that there was no threat to national security, and that there was nothing to the tales of flying saucers. During the Second World War, they were called Foo Fighters, and in 1946, as they flew over Scandinavia, they were known as ghost rockets. It wasn't until Boise, Idaho businessman Kenneth Arnold saw them near Mount Rainier, Washington, that they became flying saucers. Although the official investigation wouldn't be launched for another 6 months, the Arnold sighting was the first one to receive major coverage in the United States. Army Air Force's investigations, working out of the 4th Air Force Headquarters, became deeply involved in the Arnold sighting. Arnold made his sighting of the strange objects flying one behind the other at about 9,500 feet at a speed he estimated to be more than 1,500 miles an hour. This was something that clearly wasn't made in secret projects hidden in the mountains of New Mexico, and it wasn't something that was made by the Soviet Union as they began to press for world domination. This was something strange that had no ready explanation other than it was strange and almost impossible to believe. When Arnold landed later in the afternoon on June 24th in Yakima, Washington, he told the assembled reporters what he had seen. In the course of describing the objects, he said they moved with a motion like that of saucers skipping across the water. The shape, however, according to drawings that Arnold completed for the Army, showed objects that were heel-shaped with a blunt nose. In later drawings, Arnold elaborated, showing objects that were crescent-shaped with a scalloped trailing edge and even a clear canopy over the cockpit. Later, Arnold would provide the military with a written description of the events in a document that was originally classified, but that has long since been released. Arnold wrote,
"On June 24th, I had finished my work, and about 2 o'clock I took off for Chehalis Washington Airport with the intention of going to Yakima, Washington. I flew directly toward Mount Rainier after reaching an altitude of about 9,500 feet, which is the approximate elevation of the high plateau from which Mount Rainier rises. There was a DC-4 to the left and to the rear of me, approximately 15 miles distance, and I should judge a 14,000-foot elevation. I hadn't flown more than 2 or 3 minutes on my course when a bright flash reflected on my airplane. It startled me, as I thought I was too close to some other aircraft. I looked every place in the sky and couldn't find where the reflection had come from until I looked to the left and the north of Mount Rainier, where I observed a chain of 9 peculiar-looking aircraft flying from north to the south at approximately 9,500-foot elevation and going, seemingly, in a definite direction of about 170 degrees. The objects, were approaching Mount Rainier very rapidly, and I merely assumed they were jet planes. Anyhow, I discovered that this was where the reflection had come from, as 2 or 3 of them every few seconds would dip or change their course slightly, just enough for the sun to strike them at an angle that reflected brightly on my plane. I thought it was very peculiar that I couldn't their tails, but assumed they were some type of jet plane. I was determined to clock their speed, as I had 2 definite points I could clock them by. I watched these objects with great interest, as I had never before observed airplanes flying so close to the mountaintops. I would estimate their elevation could have varied 1,000 feet one way or another, up or down. They flew like many times I have observed geese to fly in a rather diagonal chain-like line, as if they were linked together. Their speed at the time did not impress me particularly, because I knew that our Army and Air Forces had planes that went very fast. A number of newsmen and experts suggested that I might have been seeing reflections, or even a mirage. This I know to be absolutely false, as I observed these objects not only through the glass of my airplane, but turned my airplane sideways where I could open my window and observe them with a completely unobstructed view. When these objects were flying approximately straight and level, there were just a black, thin line, and when they flipped was the only time I could get a judgment as to their size.
Arnold's sightings didn't gain front-page status immediately. Stories about it appeared in newspapers a day or two later, usually on page 8 or 9, and then with a comment about strange objects in fast flight. It was, at that time, the story of an oddity. Arnold claimed later that he thought he had seen some sort of new jet aircraft, and he was a little concerned about breaking the security around it. In the Project Blue Book files is a note about the Arnold case, which labeled it as Incident Number 37. The Air Force officers who reviewed the case wrote, "The report cannot bear even superficial examination, therefore must be disregarded. There are strong indications that this report and its attendant publicity is largely responsible for subsequent reports." Note content with a negative note in the file. The unidentified officer also wrote, "It is to be noted that the Observer has profited from his story by selling it to Fate magazine." Here for the first time were 2 accusations that would be made about many UFO cases. That is, the witnesses were in it for the money, and a suggestion that UFO reports were the result of the snowball effect. It seems to suggest that Arnold invented his tale with an eye to writing a story about it for Fate. There is no evidence to support this, and Arnold had not written any articles for any magazines prior to this sighting. The editors of Fate, and Ray Palmer specifically, who would become one of the first and most vocal proponents of the flying saucers, induced Arnold into writing about what he had seen. The point then becomes irrelevant. The article doesn't seem to have been a motive for Arnold, but more of a serendipitous reward for seeing and reporting the objects in the first place. It seems that those investigating the flying saucers didn't see a link between his sighting and photographs taken on July 7, 1947 in Phoenix, Arizona. William A. Rhodes, a self-employed scientist living in Phoenix, claimed he had taken what might be considered the first good photographs of one of the flying saucers. Initially puzzled by the case, the military did take the report seriously. The investigation that included the FBI, whose agent asked not to be identified as an FBI agent, accompanied the Army Air Force's officer to interview Rhodes. Rhodes would first tell reporters and then various government investigators, including those from the FBI and the Army's Counterintelligence Corps, that he had been on his way to his workshop at the rear of his house when he heard a distinctive whoosh that he believed to be from a P-80 Shooting Star fighter jet, which was the fastest airplane at that particular moment. Overhead, he saw something that didn't have the shape of a conventional aircraft. He hurried to his lab, grabbed his camera from his workbench, and hurried outside to a small mound in his backyard. Rhodes sighted along the side of his camera and took the first photograph. He estimated that the object was circling in the east. He advanced the film and then hesitated, thinking that he would wait for the object to get closer. Worried that it would disappear without coming closer, he snapped the second picture, finished the film roll, and his ability to record the event further. Rhodes' story, along with the pictures, appeared in the Phoenix newspaper, the Arizona Republic, on July 9th. In that article, men long experienced in aircraft recognition studied both the print and the negative from which they were made, and declined to make a guess on what the flying object might be. Rhodes said that the object appeared to be elliptical in shape and to have a diameter of 20 to 30 feet. It appeared to be at 5,000 feet when first seen and was traveling, according to Rhodes, at 400 to 600 miles per hour. It was gray, which tended to blend with the gray overcast background of the sky. The object had, according to Rhodes and a confidential report from the Project Blue Book files, what appeared to be a cockpit canopy in the center, which extended toward the back and beneath the object. The cockpit did not protrude from the surface, but was clearly visible with the naked eye. Then on August 29th, according to a memorandum from the office in charge, George Fugate, Jr., a special agent of the CIC and stationed at 4th Air Force Headquarters, interviewed Rhodes in person. Fugate was accompanied by Special Agent Brower of the Phoenix FBI office. This interview is important because of some of the confusion about location of the negatives and prints of the photograph that would develop later. During the interview, Rhodes again told the story, suggesting that he thought at first it might have been the Navy's Flying Flapjack, which had been featured on the May 1947 cover of Mechanic Illustrated. He rejected the idea because he saw no propellers or landing gear, though the overall shape of the craft matched that of the Flapjack. Later, research by various investigators, both military and civilian, showed that the Navy built 2 Flapjacks, but neither had flown outside the Bridgeport, Connecticut area. The project was canceled in 1947 as the Navy moved to jet-powered aircraft. While Rhodes was being interviewed in his home in Phoenix, Arnold, because he lived in the Northwest, Lieutenant Frank Brown, with Captain William Davidson, took a B-25 and flew up to Tacoma, Washington, where Arnold was investigating Maury Island. They all got together in Arnold's hotel room late in the evening, where Arnold showed them the debris that had been recovered on Maury Island, that Dolly and Crimson had given him. Both Army officers, Brown and Davidson, believed that the material was nothing more than smelter slag. They were unimpressed, but both men respected Arnold. They didn't tell him they believed the Maury Island tale to be a hoax. All of this takes us back to Rhodes. According to Early, Arnold asked the 2 officers what Army intelligence had learned about UFOs in the days after his sighting. Davidson sat down and then drew a picture of an object. He told Arnold, "This is a drawing of one of several photographs we consider to be authentic." Brown then added the information that tied it to the Rhodes photograph. He said, "It came from Phoenix, Arizona the other day. We have prints of it at Hamilton Field, but the original negatives were flown to Washington, D.C." It is clear that those pictures were the ones that Rhodes had taken, since there were no other UFO photographs taken in July 1947 in Phoenix, Arizona. It's interesting that Brown mentioned Hamilton Field, because Rhodes does the same thing, and Hamilton Field was part of the 4th Air Force in 1947, and Rhodes had communications with officers at 4th Air Force about his photograph as well. In the end, the Air Force decided that Arnold had been fooled by mirages created as the wind whipped up the snow at the highest levels of the mountain. Rhodes had created a hoax, no real evidence of that, but when they had no other explanation, they claimed the sighting was a hoax. What they couldn't explain and didn't try was how Rhodes could photograph an object that looked like that reported by Arnold without having seen the Arnold illustrations. The belief at the beginning of the official investigation was that trained military personnel and law enforcement officers made the best, most credible witnesses. Using this criteria, they selected a number of reports that seemed inexplicable to them and that seemed to suggest that the observed craft were beyond the technical capability of any nation on Earth. On July 4, 1947, there were a series of sightings over several Northwest states that Air Force officers labeled as either insufficient data for a scientific analysis or as unidentified. These involved police officers and airline flight crews, as well as local civilians. Many of the reports were independent of one another, but can be linked by location, time of day, and other factors. Combined rather than separated, they make a powerful statement about the nature of the flying saucers. Although the first reports were made by civilians, it was just a few minutes after 1 p.m. that police officer Kenneth A. McDowell, who was near the Portland police station, noticed that the pigeons began fluttering as if frightened. Overhead, he saw 5 large discs east of the city. According to the report he gave to military officers, 3 discs were flying east and 2 were headed to the south. All were flying at high speed and all appeared to be oscillating. McDowell alerted other police officers in an all-car alert, and they immediately broadcast the information over the police radio. 2 other police officers, Walter A. Lissy and Robert Ellis, after hearing the broadcast, stopped near a park. Overhead, they saw 3 discs moving at high speed. Neither heard any sound, but both did see flashes of brightness that could have been sunlight reflecting from a metallic surface. According to them, the objects moved erratically and changed their direction of flight. They were in sight for about 30 seconds. Both men were veterans of the Second World War, and both were civilian pilots, which suggested they had some experience around aviation and aviation assets. Patrolman Earl Patterson, after hearing the broadcast, stopped to search for any of the discs. The broadcast had suggested that the saucers were coming out of the sun, which meant they were coming from the direction of the sun. At first, Patterson noticed nothing, but a few seconds later he saw one object coming out of the west and heading towards the southwest. He said that the craft seemed to be either aluminum or eggshell white and didn't flash or reflect the sun. He also said that he didn't think they were airplanes. Like so many of the others, their flight path was erratic, wobbling and weaving. Patterson thought they were radio-controlled rather than having a living pilot on board. On the far side of the Columbia River, in nearby Vancouver, Washington, Sheriff's deputies Sergeant John Sullivan, Clarence McKay, and Fred Knives also heard the alert broadcast and ran outside to look for themselves. Over Portland, 3 to 5 miles away, they saw 20 to 30 discs that looked to them like a flight of geese. They heard a low humming sound which might or might not have been related to the objects. Not long after that, 3 harbor patrolmen who had also been monitoring the police radio band stepped outside. Captain K.A. Prynne, A.T. Ostrid, and Patrolman Casey Hoff saw 3 to 6 discs traveling at high speed. They couldn't get a good count on the number because of the bright flashes surrounding them. According to witnesses, the objects looked like huge chrome hubcaps and oscillated as they flew. Sometimes the witnesses could see a full disc, then a half moon, and then nothing at all. They did see a plane overhead as well, but all the witnesses said that what they were watching was not aircraft. This would cause Air Force investigations to wonder if aircraft might be a plausible explanation for the sightings, despite the suggestion by the witness. They thought that something the plane's pilot did, such as tossing shiny discs from the cockpit, might have caused the confusion, and later in the day, there was another report with a similar claim. The Air Force files contained a report that a former Air Corps veteran said the object he saw was unlike any plane he'd ever seen. He thought it appeared radio-controlled because the disc could change direction at a 90-degree angle without difficulty. Another witness suggested that he had seen 3 objects fly east across the Willamette River. The objects did not appear to be very high, but they were traveling very fast. He said that they looked like a metallic disc glinting in the sun. He also said that he and a neighbor saw a single disc later that afternoon. About 4 p.m., more civilians reported more discs. A woman called the police telling them she had watched a single object as shiny as a new dime flipping around. An unidentified man called to say that he had seen 3 discs, one flying to the east and the 2 heading north. They were shiny, shaped like flattened saucers, and were traveling at high speed. About an hour later, a man said that he spotted 2 white or silver objects flying southeast over Portland. Half an hour later, he sighted a single disc headed to the northeast. In Milwaukee, Oregon, not far from Portland, Sergeant Claude Cross reported 3 objects flying to the north. All were disc-shaped. All were moving at high speed. But discs overhead were the only things being reported. There were objects falling from the sky as well. Near Eugene, Oregon, a railroad cashier said he saw silver discs being dropped out of a light plane flying over the city. A man in Portland recovered a large piece of paper he had seen fall from a great height. According to reports, the time that the paper fell coincided with some of the flying saucer sightings, which might explain some of them. The best of the sightings, and the one that was labeled as unidentified, occurred about dusk as a United Airlines flight crew saw a single disc. Minutes later, they spotted several others. Captain E.J. Smith, the captain of the flight, explained it this way.
As our flight number 105 took off from Boise, Idaho at 9:04 p.m. Pacific time, the tower joshingly warned us to be on the lookout for flying saucers. My co-pilot, Ralph Stevens, was in control shortly after we got into the air. Suddenly, he switched on the landing lights. He said he thought he saw an aircraft approaching us head-on. I noticed the objects then for the first time. We saw 4 or 5 somethings. One was larger than the rest and, for the most part, kept off the right of the other 3 or 4 similar but smaller objects. Since we were flying northwest, roughly into the sunset, we saw whatever they were in at least partial light. We saw them clearly. We followed them in a northwesterly direction for about 45 miles. Then I called the attendant at the Ontario, Oregon radio tower, giving an approximate location and course for the objects. The attendant acknowledged our call, went outside to look, but was unable to see anything like what we described. Finally, the object disappeared in a burst of speed. We were unable to tell whether they outsped us or disintegrated. We were never able to catch them in our DC-3. Our airspeed at the time was 185 miles per hour. Through the Boise Air Tower, we radioed another United plane to see if it had seen anything. That plane, flying eastbound into the night, had not sighted them. Because we were following the objects at roughly the same altitude, we can't say anything about their shape except they were thin and were smooth on the bottom and rough appearing on the top.
Smith called the flight attendant, Marty Morrow, to the cockpit to, in Smith's words, verify they were actually seeing the discs. He saw 4 or more discs, 3 clustered together and a 4th flying off in the distance by itself. The objects were in sight for 10 to 15 minutes, which means that she was able to get a good look at them. Not everyone was convinced that the sightings were of unconventional aircraft. Colonel G.R. Dodson, a commander in the Oregon National Guard, told reporters that he had made an inspection of the area from the air, but that he had found nothing suspicious. Solutions were offered by some of the local residents. One thought that the sightings were the result of cottonwood blossoms drifting on the wind. Another complained about the news coverage, believing it all to be a hoax. He said that he had seen an airplane fly over, and about a minute later he saw what he believed to be bits of aluminum foil that might have been cigarette wrappers. Air Force officers mentioned that radar chaff had been seen in the area, but offered no evidence to back up the claim. The idea that a private plane pilot was dropping small silver discs took on greater importance. In the only news story that might have been of importance, the Oregon Journal noted that the only known airplanes in the area at the time of the reports were 23 B-29 bombers near Astoria. A formation of that size would have been difficult to misidentify, not to mention that the roar that the engines would have caused. Dr. James McDonald, an atmospheric scientist, interviewed Smith, the United Airlines captain, about his sighting. In a prepared statement to United States House of Representatives Committee on Science and Astronautics Symposium of the Unidentified Flying Objects in July 1968, McDonald reported,
Smith emphasized to me that there were no cloud phenomena to confuse them here, and that they observed these objects long enough to be quite certain that they were no conventional aircraft. They appeared flat on the bottom, rounded on the top, he told me. And he added that there seems to be a perceptible roughness of some sort on top, though he could not refine the description. Almost immediately after they lost sight of the first 5, a second formation of 4, 3 in a line and a 4th off to the side, moved in ahead of their position, again traveling westward but at a somewhat higher altitude than the DC-3's 8,000 feet. These passed quickly out of sight to the west at speeds which they felt were far beyond then known speeds. Smith emphasized that they were never certain of sizes and distances, but that they had the general impression that these disc-like craft were appreciably larger than ordinary aircraft. Smith emphasized that he had not taken seriously the previous week's news accounts that coined the since persistent term flying saucer. But after seeing this total of 9 unconventional, high-speed wingless craft on the evening of July 4, 1947, he became much more interested in the matter. Nevertheless, in talking with me, he stressed he would not speculate on their real nature or origin.
These reports were investigated by Army officers at the time, though the reports seemed to be fairly superficial. That is, there were objects seen high in the sky for seconds or a minute or two. As part of the Project Grudge final report written in 1949, one of the officers wrote, "This investigation can offer no definitive hypothesis, but in passing would like to note the incidents occurred on the 4th of July, and that if relatively small pieces of aluminum foil had been dropped from a plane over the area, then any one object would be visible at a relatively short distance. Even moderate wind velocities would give the illusion that fluttering, gyrating disks had gone by at great velocities. Various observers would not, of course, in this case, have seen the same objects." The officer also noted that the above is not to be regarded as a very likely explanation, but only as a possibility. The occurrence on these incidents on July 4th may have been more than coincidence. Some prankster might have tossed such objects out of an airplane as part of an Independence Day celebration.